So you know, it shouldn't be hard for everyone to hear me. I don't need to use a mic, right? Good. So Eric gave you some insight into what I've been doing, and so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And interestingly enough, there's going to be some tension here, which I want to talk about at the end. And in a sense, the tension is that we're sort of middle up, in a way. Because the work that public architecture really has been focusing on, I'll show you some projects, but the underlying piece of public architecture, this nonprofit that I started in 2002, has been about getting design firms from across the country. We now have over 1,400 design firms. We're in all 50 states to do pro bono services for nonprofit organizations. So in one sense, it's sort of grassroots that nonprofits and firms are making decisions to apply their craft from a mission-based standpoint as opposed to a monetary standpoint. But they're serving what would normally be seen as grassroots. And so in a sense, it's sort of in the middle, serving grassroots. And there are some real terrific opportunities, but there's some challenges. And I want to end by showing you some of the outstanding questions that come about when you bring what is seen in this country as the highest level of design services to underserved populations. So I'm going to start with some statistics that help to frame the opportunity for the work, and the work being the design of the built environment. And this is research that we didn't do, that we're just collecting from different researchers, mostly in the U.S., but in some cases in Europe. If you grow up a poor child, or grow up in a poor neighborhood, as a child, you'll have, on average, 5 times more lead in your blood system. If you're in a affordable housing complex, if there is the presence of green space, on average there will be a drop in domestic violence of 25%. If you're in a healthcare environment that has full spectrum light, mostly natural light, but you can actually offset some of that with artificial light with full spectrum, patients will report a 22% drop in pain, and the need for painkillers will drop 21%. If you're in a classroom, K through 12, that has full spectrum light, on average, math scores will go up 20%, and English comprehension will go up 26%. And this is the weird one. If you were a student who went to a school, K through 12, that had full spectrum light in the classroom, you will be, on average, 3/4 of an inch taller. Sadly, I went to a school that did not have full spectrum light. So I'm going to show you a couple of projects, and then I'll circle back and talk a little bit about public architecture. But I'm leading up to, more importantly, hopefully a sort of question and answer, a conversation that we'll have later. So in the beginning, I ran a private practice. I went to art school, went to Rhode Island School of Design. There you go. Did you go to Disney?
How do you like the BEB?
I love the BEB.
Really?
Yeah. And you didn't?
No, but I only did it.
I see. And when I came out in 1990, the idea, and this is true for most of the design schools in the country at that time, it was really designer as artist. And the idea of worrying or thinking about or being inclusive of social outcomes really was presented as something that neutered the clarity of design intent. And so I came out of school at a time when it was very unpopular to think about social outcomes as part of work. And I accepted that pretty much hook, line, and sinker. And I was very much interested in design for design's sake. And I ended up starting a private practice very early out of school here in San Francisco. And I was doing primarily high-end residential, which I was delighted to do. One of the great things about high-end residential is that you're making agreements with one or two people, maybe a family of four, something like that. And so whatever you can craft together is the world in which you can find value. And so you can do some very unique and interesting things, and because there were financial resources, you could focus on details and materials and spend a lot of energy doing that. And I found that terribly rewarding. About 10 years into my practice, the project scale started getting to a size and a type. We started moving away from high-end residential to larger projects that had impacts on the entire neighborhoods. And then, as we did that, it opened up the opportunity to think about more than just the family and the materials that we're using. You could start to think about the neighborhood and people, and the impact on people who you never meet. And it opened up for me a tremendous amount of curiosity and interest in these larger questions about the social role of the design environment. And as a way of exercising that interest, I decided to start a nonprofit, which I had utterly no idea of what I was doing. And I started a nonprofit, sort of literally crafted in the middle of the night, and showed up the next day at the office and said, let's do this thing. And we went down this road, which was fueled by the meager income of my private practice. And we just bumped along, and then, a decade plus later, it actually seems to be something that is more valuable than that early impulse. So very early on, we started asking these questions about how can the design and built environment impact these social outcomes, and we started looking for things that, for problems to take on. And one of them was the day labor community that I saw day in and day out, mostly on Army Street, which is now, at the time, it was called Army Street, but now it's Cecil Chavez. And there are other places in the city. And this became just a question. How could we have a positive impact on the day labor community? And I did what, and my office did, the only thing we knew how to do, which is what we did with our high-end clients, which we sat down with them and we talked to them, we interviewed them. I had, as a first step, had hired an executive director and said, look, this is your job to make this happen. He was a previous client of mine, he was an attorney, and he spoke fluent Spanish. And so we sat down with these guys and just talked to them. And we learned the life of the day laborer, which is utterly fascinating and not what you would expect. It was not what we expected. And we began to craft what could be, we thought, a way of supporting their interests. And I'm going to show you a project. This is several steps in. We got asked by an organization in LA to design, to take the sort of research that we had done and design a day labor station for a very large community. It's a community of over 100 day laborers at that time. And so we developed this strategy. It's within a piece of public land, and it was large enough that we could have a community garden that we thought could be, there would be some sort of sympathetic use between the garden and the day labor station. And we had ideas around creating a simple cafe that could use some of the vegetables that were coming out of the vegetable garden. We could use it to train day laborers and help them earn an income to support themselves and also support the day labor station. And other aspects became critical to us as service delivery, which the classroom environment was really important to them. Learning English was premier, but also learning other skills was very important. So this building, or this sort of collection, this sort of mini campus, included a classroom environment, and then most importantly, getting work. And we learned about how they like to negotiate their salary each time, and the freedom of being able to do that was important to them. So that was an early project that we got, as part of this, we got part of a show that the Cooper Hewitt Museum in New York, which is part of the Smithsonian. We were part of a show called The Design for the Other 90%, and then that sort of propagated interest around the country, and we ended up talking to a couple of dozen municipalities who were interested in seeing this happen. And interestingly enough, not one of these was built. However, and for an interesting reason, which was it's a wildly under-resourced area of interest. And this was just before the collapse of the economy, or the Great Recession, so to speak. But it did influence the conversation around the value of the built environment, the place in which day laborers work. And so we didn't really achieve what we thought we would achieve, but we achieved something that turned out to have value that we didn't fully understand when we started. And that is, there wasn't a conversation. There was, in fact, resistance from the nonprofits who were serving day laborers around making better facilities. It seemed too precious. It seemed an extravagance. But in fact, one of the things that we illustrated is that the component, the place in which they sought work, if it was more organized, had greater care, it shifted the way people understood the value of labor. And so that's one project. I'm going to show you one more, and then I'm going to show you work that others are doing, and then get back to this question about how do we design for communities that don't have the same cultural framework that most designers have. This is a healthcare clinic in a fire station. I'm going to show you sort of how this is about. There's, in Alameda County, the healthcare services, the public healthcare service in Alameda County, which is very progressive nationwide healthcare services, is run by a very interesting and forward-thinking guy by the name of Alex Briscoe. And they've been placing clinics in public schools in Alameda County as a way of bringing critical services, medical services, to underserved populations. Kids who would not otherwise find themselves going to a health clinic. And they put it right where the schools existed, and they're having quite a bit of success with that. But they were frustrated that they couldn't bring it outside of the public school environment. You can't have people off the street come into a public school environment. The risk is too high. And he had an epiphany one day that there was an infrastructure of services that existed already that they could tap into, which were the fire stations. Not only in Alameda County, but around the country. Every fire station in the United States has medically trained professionals. In order to be a firefighter, you have to have a basic level of medical training. 83% of the calls that fire stations get on average across the country are medical in nature. Only 70% are fire. They are already part of our medical system. So he had this idea of placing clinics in fire stations, and he reached out to the California Health Endowment to get funding for it. they were concerned that he wasn't looking at this quite rigorously enough, and they turned to public architecture, asked public architecture to work with him. So we sat down and we used one of the tools that we used, that they brought to us, we didn't come up with, was the access to big data around where were these vulnerable populations. So we worked with them to identify the issues that and the research that they had through this mostly GIS data, and we could pinpoint where the populations who were not using the primary care system, they were using the emergency care system for everyday medical needs, or they weren't using anything. And so we could use this overlap of data to identify exactly where those populations were. Then we could trace from that location to the local fire station. And one of the amazing attributes of the fire stations is that almost every demographic trusts the fire department. It has something like a 93% approval rating amongst government agencies. It's the highest approval rating of all government agencies. So we knew that it wasn't a barrier to use the fire departments. In fact, it was a plus. So we developed a strategy for Alameda County, but the idea was to launch it nationally, which we have begun to do. And we developed a prototype for this that was meant to illustrate how this strategy could be used in a way that also incorporated more forward thinking approaches to the environment around it. So can you incorporate outdoor space with a clinic environment? Can you make it open? Can you use technology to break down barriers of language and other things that keep people from seeking medical services? And so that's actually an ongoing process, and there's a whole lot of other information that backs this up, and I'm happy to talk about it if people are interested. And I mentioned very briefly that, and these numbers are now stale, as they always are, which is good because we're growing all the time. We started a program very early on because we realized that these one-off projects only scratched the surface, and we were interested in a scalable outcome. And so we realized that the small nonprofit that we had really couldn't have the impact that we desired. So we decided very naively that we would begin to change the profession, or try to change the profession. We did so by coming up with a very simple idea, and we were looking at the legal profession as a way forward. And we decided that if we could institutionalize pro bono service, we could begin to connect designers who normally wouldn't have access to underserved populations, connect them through nonprofit organizations. And so we asked every design firm in the country to give a minimum of 1% of their time to pro bono service. And we originally called this, back in 2003, the 1%. And we realized many years later that we were outgunned by the Occupy movement in the branding of what the 1% meant. And so just recently we changed that name to 1+. And so we, at this point, have over 1,400 firms. We're in all 50 states. Those firms are contributing about $60 million annually in pro bono services to nonprofits around the world, primarily in the United States. We have an online matching service, which is essentially online dating. We match domestic nonprofits. We haven't yet reached out and are matching international. We expect that will happen in the next few years. But the firms are also they're doing on their own international work. And this is just a way of thinking about where those services are going. Traditional design services, there's a fair amount of debate about this, that design firms are really contributing to 10% of the population. There's been other estimates around 2% of the population. I actually think it's quite a bit more than that. But we do know that there's a very, very large population in this country that are not served by the design community. And the nonprofit, we just look at the nonprofit community alone, and these numbers are slightly off. Actually, these numbers are pretty close. These are updated numbers. But there are 1.5 million nonprofits in the United States. They employ about 10% of the workforce in this country. And it's a $1.8 trillion annual economy. And our point is that the design community serves some part of that economy, but it's a very, very small part of that economy. And we're suggesting that there's not only a philanthropic reason to support nonprofits, but there's actually a business reason to support nonprofit, which we're very interested in because that's what will fuel more work, not only our ask for philanthropy, but the business opportunity here. So I'm going to show you a couple of projects, and then I'm going to pose a sort of larger question. MoMA in New York has a kind of summertime project that it does in PS1, which is in Queens, and it asks a sort of emerging firm to put an installation into their courtyard in Queens every year. And this is a project done by a group called Interborough. And so what they did is they went around the neighborhood and interviewed different folks in the neighborhood. This guy runs a small ballet school. They asked him, what do you need? What are some physical needs that you have? This guy's part of the local Teamsters Union. He had ideas, and they cataloged all the things that the neighbors wanted. And it ranged from shade to mirrors that the guy that ran the ballet school, to a lifeguard chair, to ping pong tables. And then they took all those needs and they assembled them and created this courtyard experience for PS1 users. And so here's some of the things that were replaced. These are the mirrors for the ballet school, the trees that the Teamsters wanted, and each had a tag. Essentially, it was lent to PS1 for the summer, and then it was distributed to those folks. And so there was a climbing wall for a kindergarten and the like. So this is a kind of design approach where there isn't an aesthetic agenda. It's more, what are the functional pieces that the community needs? Can we aggregate them? Can we make them useful for one purpose? And then can we redistribute them? And so there's no loss of resources. And one of the things that they were pushing against is the previous PS1s would create something and then those assets went into the landfill, or maybe they were recycled, but energy was put back into them. And so they wanted to turn that on its head. This is just a single slide for a project that a firm down in Los Angeles called Marvel Ratzinger, which is a design-build firm. They both have a construction arm and a design arm. And they started a guerrilla group, which I'm outing them here a little bit because, I think it's sort of common knowledge, but Marvel Ratzinger didn't own up to the fact that they created this group called Heavy Trash. And in fact, whenever they're seen in public or do videos, they have masks on. But yeah, it's very exciting. So in their neighborhood, there was this bit of outdoor space, and there was some homeless activity. And the local DPW, in response to that homeless activity, put 8-foot-high fence around the whole thing. There was a gate on it, but they put a lock on it 24 hours a day. And so Marvel Ratzinger, acting as Heavy Trash, said, well, we want to comment on this. So they, because they're contractors, they built this ladder and slide and off-site, and then assembled it very quickly on-site, and then walked away.
And it gave people access to the park, and it started a debate about what is the right solution to this, and it stayed up for about 6 weeks, and then DPW took it down. Not DPW, the Department of Public Works. And so it's sort of designer as provocateur, and this one is a lot of fun. They designed and built this sign, several of these signs, and put them up, announcing a new Aqua Line, which was a public transit line from downtown to the beach, and gave a phone number and said, you know, ta-da, the new Aqua Line's coming, but it was all a ruse. But the phone number was real, and so they called the city and said, "Oh, this is great. We're so excited about the Aqua Line." And there were some local articles. Only discovered that in fact it was just heavy trash, trying to encourage people to start asking questions about why wasn't there a public transit line from that location to the. And then finally, I'm going to use a group that some of you may have heard about. This is Sam Mockbee. He was an architect in the South, in Alabama, and he was teaching at Auburn. And he became interested in doing work in the most rural parts of Alabama. And he started a thing called the Rural Studio, where they literally took students and they designed and built buildings that were in service of this rural community, a place called New Bern, Alabama, and which is about 3 hours away from Auburn, the university. And unfortunately, Sam Mockbee died of cancer, and this gentleman, Andrew Freer, took over. Oddly, a Brit in one of the most remote places in the South, and they did some really interesting stuff. But there's, and I'll tell you the story. And I know Rural Studio quite well. I'm actually part of their advisory board. But they started doing these experimental projects with the uber poor of the Black Belt of Alabama. These are people that are really at some of the most poverty-stricken areas of the country. And this is a project where they took discarded carpet tiles that were supplied by Interface, and they essentially built a house. And every house that they ever have done is named after the person they built it for. And I've forgotten this woman's name. I have not seen this house. I've seen most of the projects. I think I've seen all the other projects I have to show you. But it's these sort of exotic design, sort of almost academic design-driven projects, then gifted for free to either the town or individuals. I think this woman's named Rosemarie. I've been to this house. It's actually quite a lovely house, but I don't know if the aesthetics of it and Rosemarie there and her furniture begin to sort of talk about the tension there. But it exists. Now, the great thing about Rural Studio and what Andrew Freer has done and what Sam Mockbee started is those guys are utterly embedded in that community. Some of these projects take 10 years before they're built because they're engaged with the community all along the way. There's a series of houses that were done, and they're still in the progress of doing that. And the goal is to build houses commercially by local contractors for $20,000. They're getting closer and closer to it. They're at about $35,000 a house at this point. And they're really trying to operationalize this and address a real need. And these houses, the 20K, what they call the 20K houses, even though they've realized they're probably never going to make it to 20,000. That was a beautiful and ambitious goal, and even at 35,000, it's extraordinary what they're able to build. they're quite humble and they're less exotic from an aesthetic standpoint. And so as they develop these things, they seem to fit in a little bit better. This is the Boys and Girls Club that was done by one of the students. So students build these. And they are the, hands down, the premier student-led design build efforts anywhere in the world, without a doubt. And so this is the Boys and Girls Club. Acts as a Boys and Girls Club, people show up, kids show up every day. This is the local Boy Scout lodge. This is Town Hall. Again, student design, student built. This is a local chapel. This was everything except for the first house with the carpet tiles and this. Everything else was done while Andrew Freer was leading this group. And this is San Mocby, which tends to be on the more experimental side. The glazing is all comes out of the local auto wreck yard. These are windshields from cars. And this is a chapel, which unfortunately is sort of gone in disrepair because no one's used it. So this is the very end. And so what I wanted to sort of suggest is, if there's interest, I wanted to use this to have this conversation about what we see as the highest level of aesthetic achievement, meaning the design community, and arguably what the country adopts as what is a high level of aesthetic achievement, is really focused at a very narrow cultural group. Those that tend to be highly educated, it's those that sort of had similar cultural experiences. When we apply those aesthetic expectations to populations that have a very different cultural context in which to frame this work, are we bringing them appropriately the best that the design community can provide, which I think is a high aspiration and good. What is the highest level of service we can provide? That's what I asked myself when we shifted from high-end residential to serving, say, day laborers. We wanted to bring the same level of service. We didn't want to compromise. But is that really the best that we can bring a community that might otherwise feel it's not coming from their own cultural expectations? I can tell you from meeting folks that use the buildings that the Rural Studio has built, I can tell you from presenting to day laborers the proposals that we had made. For the most part, when you work closely with the community, they're charmed by it. I think most of the folks that have, the woman that moved into the house made of carpet tiles, thinks it's kind of kooky but lovable. She kind of loves it that the students put all that energy into it, and she's proud of that house. But it's this kind of otherworldly thing. But for her, she's adopted it, and that's the story for most of these folks. But they have this very intimate relationship with those that designed and built it. And it happened over a couple of years. But there are other examples where it just feels foreign and doesn't feel charming, doesn't feel like this was a gift to me, and these students are really just doing their best, even though I don't understand it. It doesn't really speak to the world that what I see as the highest level of aesthetic options. So I don't know, does this resonate with anybody? Does anybody have any questions or comments?
I think about Bruce Goff, and all the wacky stuff he did in Oklahoma.
Yeah.
And, you know, the same kind of thing, recycled materials. And I really don't know that much about his clients. But, I mean, I do not know that culture should not be challenged in a little bit of way. I mean, I think variety is possibly something that can add to our culture. I mean, I spent some time in Pennsylvania, and yes, everything kind of looks like a shaker box sometimes in some places until you get to, you know, the usual strip malls, the usual cities. And in a rural setting, it seems like there is a little less junk than, say, if you were to drop one of these things into a strip mall, and where I think you want to intervene the most in a strip mall is in some kind of aesthetic justice kind of way. But I certainly think that other than the fact that experimental buildings, in my experience, need much more care, need much more going back and you know, figuring out what went right, what went wrong. And I don't see that it would be wrong to say, with the client's participation, hey, let's put something cool. Let's you know, say, here's my identity in the world. I mean, I think you're familiar with Toro Lab, an emergency architecture down in Tijuana.
Say it again.
Toro Lab, an emergency architecture down in Tijuana.
Maybe I'll get it as you keep talking about it.
They basically build things for cheap and free in the slums, and they try to make it as beautiful and interesting as they can.
So, is there any correlation between the involvement that the community who is to be the recipient of this thing has? Is there any correlation between that and the perceived value of this thing? I guess what I mean by that is, if I'm able to participate in the making of something, I feel that it's more my own.
Yeah.
I wonder, is that kind of an element in this? Has that been studied? Is there any clear pattern?
I mean, I think anecdotally, there's a lot of understanding. Those that participate, sense of ownership goes up a lot. But there's a really interesting thing about power. So right after public architecture began, I was asked to give a talk, and the folks that spoke in front of me were going into these small downtowns, and they were working with communities and revitalizing downtowns. And they made a statement, which was a statement that resonated, particularly in the 60s and 70s, amongst a certain group of designers. They said, we are not the designers, it's the community that designs it. We simply draft it up, we just draw it up. And I was coming out of serving relatively wealthy people, and I realized if I said that to my client, they'd fire me, and they should. Oh, you design it, I'll just draw it. No, we're hiring you. It would be like if you said that to your surgeon. Let me tell you where to cut. You just do the cutting. And I thought, that's not right. It's not right to say, because you're not bringing all that you can bring. But the intention is good, that you need to bring that ownership. But what's fascinating is, it's still not the same, because, my client who runs a hedge fund, way back when, I didn't have one of those, but, as an example, runs a hedge fund, has a sense of power and control over me as a service provider that Rosemary does not. So I can ask Rosemary any number of questions to understand what she's about, but her sense of her ability to control what I do and give me some leeway, but really tell me what to do, is different. And so managing that is really complex. So the students in the little studio case spend a lot of time with the people who use those buildings, whether it's a residence or it's the Boys and Girls Club, understanding what their needs are, but the aesthetic choices are really of the students. And in many ways, that's appropriate. They're students. They're exploring their own sector. And the town of Newburgh, which has doesn't even have a stop sign. The town of Newburgh has sort of embraced, well, this is and it's a good deal for us. We get these buildings essentially for free, and we get the kookiness of these kids who have design visions. And so it's a good barter for them. I mean, I think the vast majority would say, this is great, but it's kooky. And so I think participation is really valuable. And because they're so connected to that community, they've made that work really, really well. But imagine if you're not that connected community and you're having that conversation with Rosemary, oh yeah, I understand you want the kitchen here, and you want that there, and you can maneuver that stuff. But when it comes down to the aesthetic decisions, the nuance of that's very, very difficult. And I think often that gets applied, what we think is the best aesthetic decisions we can make, it's applied to someone who in many cases wouldn't choose those same aesthetic decisions. So it's a real dilemma. And you can dumb these things down, and it happens all the time, and that feels almost worse, right? Like, oh, well, I'm going to design something for what I think you want that is, 3 notches down, sort of in cultural sophistication, the way I see that. And occasionally they nail it. I think the 20K houses, and I don't have a bunch of examples, but the 20K houses start to sort of do that. They seem much more of that place. They're more humble. They're not as exotic. And I think they're more easily transformed quickly by an individual who feels like it's their place. But once you start, stretching your aesthetic muscles, then it starts getting harder to sort of understand. And I think these public buildings are much easier. Boys and Girls Club, somehow that seems just like fun. It doesn't seem weird in a way. It just seems like fun.
Well, for public building, I think it would be more of it's kind of a thing of pride, right? It's like a gift given to a lot of people. It's shared by a lot of people. It's a thing that the community owns. If you are the recipient of this extravagant sort of building, you're going to be the subject of envy. You're going to feel kind of like you're in the spotlight.
Right.
I think it's a very different dynamic there.
Right. I agree.
Back to the slide with 20. There seems to me a different level of respect that's involved in this property. It's starting with a constraint, which is how can you create something that's of value.
Yeah, right.
But there's a respect for tradition
Yeah.
and for the locality
Right.
and for these people that seems to be inherent in that. And I think what we want to have is that picture. And starting out with respect to those people. What this reminds me of is I'm involved in New Orleans doing Book 6 for Desire, which had been redesigned. And it was going to look just like the old Desire in many ways, with the same site plan. And it was a little vague to get to come down. I said, how would this be? Why would we design the same thing? It turned out they were using the same architects who always did the maintenance for, repairs for the public housing. So instead, running design association, came in and we did these charrettes with people who live in the existing design. And part of the process was housing for scared to death. Was took them on bus tours around neighborhoods in New Orleans and suburbs and said, what things do you like? And then developed a design process which came out of the things that people said. And you know, they were fairly extravagant. They're like very simple places with porches and other stuff. It was only like a mile away. It wasn't hard to predict, but it came out of them. And so I think starting with a respect for them as a client and giving them choice and enabling their choices and educating them in part about what those choices are, but letting it seems to be treating them with the same respect you would anybody else. And part of the terrible stuff, I think, we see experimental public housing in France or something, is it's just imposed on people because, well, we don't have any choice, so we can make up our own aesthetics. So I think the notion that you're operating with them as a client seems to be a fundamental notion that I hear.
Yes.
I have a question about the firehouse plans.
Yep.
You said that they were already, or not already, they were partly being implemented nationally, right? Was something that?
Well, so the focus was on Alameda County, and then we're sort of gearing up to making this, sort of releasing this nationally, hoping that other communities see value in it. But was there a question behind it?
Yeah, how far into implementation are they in the instances? Or
Well, so Alameda County just built the first one.
Really?
And so there's a really interesting backstory. In order to make something like this happen, you can imagine there are all kinds of stakeholders, right?
Yeah.
One of them, a big one, is the fire union, the firefighters union. They, after looking at it and reflecting on it, came out strongly for it. It was really, really fascinating what drives them and why they were for it. And I can talk about it, but and there were all these other, political factions and political stakeholders that had to be rallied around in order to make this happen. And as this thing was about to be launched, that the county council was going to vote on it, and they were going to build 7 of them, somebody came out of the woodwork and absolutely killed the thing, and that was the Nurses Association. California Nurses Association, very, very powerful political community. Alameda, yes, but statewide, and they said no way, and they stopped it in its tracks. And the reason they said no, I think, which is really, really interesting, is that the business model to make this work, and we did in tandem the physical model and the business model. The business model to make this work had an EMT, fire department staff EMT in the clinic, but also had a nurse, and in some cases had physician's assistants, and in some cases had physicians. And the Nurses Association said, we do not want an EMT. EMTs are only in emergency settings, they're not in clinical settings, and once you put one in a clinical setting, it's scope creep. And they're paid less than nurses, and it was a threat to potentially the future of nursing employment. And so we had this big meeting, and it was sort of like, everyone felt like they had been, cut off at the knees. And the fire chief made a statement, which I thought was brilliant. The fire chief said, I'll make every single EMT that works in there a nurse. All the department nurses union will have to train a nurse. I thought, done. Like, it was a perfect jujitsu right? Isn't that like, isn't jujitsu, you take whatever energy they're giving you and you don't try to block it, you just So like, wow, this is fantastic. It wasn't good enough. They said no. And they stayed out of it. So the one that was built, Sam Leandros, local fire chief, said, screw it. I don't care what they did to me. And he said, we're going to build it. Right? Yeah, but all the rest of them said, no, we won't go against the Nurses Association. So I think that's particular to this Nurses Association, and over time I think they'll give in to it, because actually I think it's positive for them. But so the reason we're interested nationally is because our guess is lots of other municipalities will be interested in this, won't have the same thing.
Yeah, of course. So, have you visited the San Andreas site, or?
I haven't. Other folks in the office have gone. The hard news for the designer is that it has nothing to do with the design parameters that we set. It was adopted, it's a long story, but they simply, in order to get what they were hoping was federal funding, they had to move very quickly, and they just took a neighboring firehouse that was this Mediterranean-style stucco thing, and they just duplicated it. So
it's there.
but it's there. So the function is there. It's actually a larger clinic than we had designed because of the community. There was actually a physician on staff. Yes, sir. You and then you.
Oh, okay. I was wondering if you could give a little bit more insight into the design process when you're working with communities and how that differs from the typical process of working with high-end clients. And to kind of frame the question a little bit, I'm not an architect, but I'm an engineer consultant, so I work on a lot of architectural projects. And I know from that experience that the role of the expert is very much like the surgeon that you were talking about, that you're kind of expected to incite change, that you're expected to drive the change. And I speculate that it's a very different process when working with communities, because unlike clients, they're not looking for innovative ways to drive revenue, but they're looking for ways to manifest their relationships with each other or their relationships with the things that they need. So what I'm curious about is, I'm familiar with how things get accepted or rejected in mainstream projects, but what are the nuances of like a community that rejects a project that you designed? Like why did it fail, or why does it succeed?
And then the question is always the rejection isn't 100%, the acceptance isn't 100%, right? So you're navigating, is the rejection acceptable, right? Because some part of the group is not going to go for it, or they have their own personal interests that are not being supported, and so it's a very, very difficult thing to try to navigate these things. And I think there's a lot of different strategies, and a lot has to do with the scale of the community that you're serving, and even communication strategies are interesting. You do something that has an impact on South Market. I forget the specific number, but something like there are 27 languages spoken in South Market in households. It's something crazy like 42% of households in South Market don't speak English as their first language, right? So even getting access, even in basic communication within South Market, isn't even realistic in many cases. So there are a lot of people working very hard to engage those communities, but for the most part, I have to say, I think the tools that we have are missing the mark, and they always have been. And, particularly those challenging, very complex markets. So if you're in a community that is that complex, and you have to deploy all these different kinds of tools. If you're in a community that's not quite as complex, more accessible, then you can do very much one-on-one engagement. And one simple strategy is to identify the community leaders that are the voice of the community, the reliable, authentic voice of the community as best as you can do that. And then you engage those larger stakeholders, the ministers, the county council members, the guy on the street who everyone looks to as the sort of mayor of the street, and you build a coalition with them, and you begin to craft what this looks like, and then I think one of the tools that works best is before you design anything or show anything that's designed, you get as much consensus as you can around principles. What are we trying to achieve together? And then as the design rolls out, the conversation is less about aesthetics. I like this, I don't like that, I like blue, I don't like red. And more about, are we achieving the principles that we all set out to achieve? And that's where you can get really interesting solutions that are not what is aesthetically agreed applicable, or expected, I should say, to everybody, but because the core principles meet what the community wants, there's much more flexibility around what it looks like. And I think the most successful projects are around that. But it's a crazy, crazy thing to do well. And I think there are very few people that do it well. And it's one of the Achilles heels of the design process in these kinds of environments. So I think we have a long way to go. New technology is really interesting. We're just beginning to explore. So, being able to look on your smartphone or being able to go on a website and then have it translated in 27 different languages and things like that are new tools that are beginning to have an impact positively. You had a question?
That's not this guy. I was trying to speak. Yeah, your hand up for 5 minutes.
That guy, Mark? No.
Okay. Yeah, so I teach at a local university, and I work with a lot of students doing these type of urban planning studios. And I've been personally struggling with a couple of challenges. One is if you look at the pipeline of planners and designers and architects, they often come from sort of certain privileged backgrounds. So when you put them into environments and underserved populations, they're kind of grappling with this cultural disconnect. And so the question is, how do we kind of train them? That's one thing. And second is, oftentimes, I find that my students are in a state of paralysis where they're almost wanting to be humble and wanting to come in and have a sense of, I want to listen to what the community wants. But then that almost puts them in a position where they're unable to move forward and kind of put their professional judgment. So I'm wondering, from your personal experience, if you work with students, what are some ways to address these challenges?
Well, I think a willingness to be more flexible about what is aesthetically acceptable to the academy is something that we have to tackle, because I think it's a fairly narrow slice of what is aesthetically acceptable to the academy. So having a little more flexibility and allowing students to be a little more flexible is hard, because everyone's looking at the same imagery, everyone's looking at what is being celebrated as the highest work. And that's what you're seeing in Rural Studio in many cases, right? In that town hall, and I was actually, let's see, where is town hall? I mean, this thing in real life looks more austere than it does here. And I was there when the students were showing the very first sketches, and it was this sort of Scandinavian. By the way, the walls are pure timber. It's just something like 14 inches of timber. It's beautifully done. It's crazy the level of refinement that these students got. I think it's probably the most refined building that Rural Studios ever delivered. But it was sort of like, come on, really? This thing, I mean, the windows that are at the corner, at the time when they presented, there was no window. So you drive down the street, it's a city hall, and there's no way to look in. There's no access, visual, there's no sense of, and it was this terribly austere thing. Anyway, to get back to your question, the Rural Studio and you and others have to, I think, balance this. You have to allow students to experiment. You have to allow students to try it out. At the same time, how can you bring the kind of temperament that serving those communities requires? And in some cases, I think you have to sort of give in and just say, look, this is going to be a little bit of a bloodbath. And so we'll do our best to sort of navigate this, like the Rural Studio does. And then I guess, I'm sort of bouncing around a bit, but I think the other thing is allow the students to, as I said, allow the students to sort of give themselves a break on the aesthetic piece, but allow the students to really adopt the goals of the people they're serving. And it turns out that those goals are actually far more interesting than they start to sound, when you start thinking about where the kitchen goes, or this has, which you can't see in this image, it's off to the right-hand side, but there's big barbecue pits out, because that's what they do in City Hall. They not only they have their sort of City Hall meetings, but they have these big community gatherings where they roast a pig. And so those kinds of things actually humanize this building in ways that just by listening and adopting what are the goals of the community, I think it begins to bend what you hold up as the best design. Because you start thinking like, well, actually having a really good pig roast is in fact part of what it means to do a town hall. And then all of a sudden that starts to transform, starts to soften a building that's got, that's 14 inches of timber stacked on top of it. Mark, did you have a question?
I have a question just because I feel like there's an entrepreneurial impulse in a lot of this. We want to create low-cost housing. We want to help solve the problems that day laborers face. And then you're coming up with maybe aesthetic solutions, but real solutions, but they tend to usually be one-offs. And I was wondering your thoughts on sort of the maybe not entrepreneurialism, but replicability, and why we don't see more of these projects sort of take flight in the way that other people might be looking at a problem and then also looking at how it scales, to a place where it becomes a solution, right? Like because the $20,000 or let's say $35,000 house seems much better than a trailer, but most people will probably in those rural areas have trailers. So the solution is there, but it seems hard to get to the scale.
And I would say a lot of that has to do with the economic engine behind it. There's a big economic engine for trailers, and there isn't for 20K houses. There could be, and actually I think Andrew is really trying to figure this out, although he's not, he would self-identify that he's not really equipped to really fully understand the economic drivers behind it and how to tap into those. But there's a lot of money to be made off of bad, trailers, and they're littered throughout. And I don't know if you know some of the backstory to the trailer. Trailers, because they're on wheels, are mortgages are like cars.
Right, chattel.
That's right. They're not houses, so the mortgages are bad. The depreciation on them are bad. The resale value is terrible, and so it's a really rotten deal all around for affordable housing. Although it is affordable, and so that's their competition. That's who they're trying to beat. But the problem is there's not a whole bunch of money to be made off of giving away plans for how local contractors can design houses or build 35,000 houses. So I think a lot of these things face the scale challenge of that the people behind them are looking at addressing a problem that doesn't come with an aggressive, big-scale business budget. And I think for good reason. I mean, I think the people that are pursuing these, I think, are setting those business interests aside, which is, I think, great in one sense, but it's unfortunate that because we're not going to see so many things, we're not going to scale. And so, public architecture with the One Plus program, I mean, one of the things that we said right away is this needs to be economically attractive for design firms. And so we've I don't think we've only done a reasonable job, we haven't done a very good job, I think, of making the business case for why design firms should be giving their time away for Bono. But we've been arguing that actually it's good business. And ultimately we get tapped into something that's a little less than 10% of the economy, but 10% of the economy as an untapped resource max. And so that's where that's the first thing I would point out. I think, unfortunately, I think people aren't stepping into these problems. Those that are entrepreneurial are trying to solve social entrepreneurs and not business entrepreneurs. And I wish we could sort of marry the two and maybe that, and actually the Oak Fellowship are, I'd like to see do more of that. I'd like to see some, some money-centric or capable folks. I mean, you're somebody who understands those two sides in ways that very few people do. So you're going to solve it.
Yeah, that's-
I have a follow-up to that, which is, it just strikes me, I was reading this piece written by Michael Graves about how he was like, I'm critical of capitalism and all, but the fact of the matter is, when I design a chair for Target, like, people can have a $5 designer chair, and any other channel that I choose as a designer, like, it's gonna be a $500 chair, and so like, I feel weird about it, but ultimately these people have $5 design chairs, and that's awesome to me, and, you create a whole line, I guess, of stuff for Target. It strikes me that designers perhaps could pursue business with a social mission in mind, just with this sort of an agenda. But perhaps another thing that would allow this kind of thing to scale would actually be similar to what the federal government did. I'm just thinking of some of the thesis research I was doing. And so first the federal government with the Better Homes in America campaign, they were actually trying to convince people themselves to go and buy houses and build houses so that they'd be basically private owners of houses. And it worked okay, but when things really took off was when the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration, started to guarantee loans. And they sort of, instead of doing the actual work of creating the houses or putting people in houses or paying for the construction of houses, they just enabled, by insuring loans, this whole financial infrastructure to create this very incendiary product, which was the suburban single-family detached home. And they had certain ideas about, or certain criteria for what was a worthy house to get guaranteed, and other houses were not. Of course, there were really horrible practices like redlining involved there, where you couldn't, they wouldn't guarantee loans in mixed race areas and whatnot. So I think there's also this policing aspect to any kind of project that you want to do. Actually, that's sort of maybe a follow-up part of the question is how, if we are engaging in these socially important projects, do we prevent our work from basically being part of a larger set of power dynamics? Maybe we can't, but I don't know. Another bit of research I was doing was looking at the ways in which all these sort of socialists and whatnot were being roped in by these social reformers into these organizations like the National Municipal League because they felt these people were really into things like public utilities and public streets and public right-of-ways and whatever, and they actually abandoned all these sort of radical political projects in order to do these social projects, which were themselves part of policing and stabilizing the capitalist economy. So this is interesting sort of history of really, really progressive people being rolled into almost colonizing projects. But I guess that's a cluster of questions I have. How do we produce other infrastructures that are not necessarily themselves architecture, like financial infrastructures or commercial infrastructures? And how do we think about how these things engage with other power structures?
Can I tack a question onto that as well? It's very much in the same line as what you were asking and how you continued it as well. What I'm interested in hearing your perspective on is, there's these spaces, these buildings are being designed using input from the people who have a certain utility in they have a certain invested personal relationship in their day-to-day lives in these spaces. The day laborers, for example, they develop a certain level of power in being able to determine that they have an educational space that they have access to, or this town hall, for example. And it, I'm also hearing that this process of creating these spaces is contradictory to the model of profitable design without that type of capitalist infrastructure where there are loans available for it necessarily. And so what I'm interested in hearing your perspective on is, do you think that this type of design, that the future of this type of design, especially on, not just scalable in terms of geography, but scalable in terms of time, for development of spaces that are used far in the future, do you think that privatized design studios have a role in creation of these types of spaces? Or do you think that this decision-making process that involves the people who actually use the spaces is more of the future of that, and that it's going to be less centralized and maybe more distributed?
Well, I mean, I think this is the question that, if I'm understanding right, that Eric's asking. His interests have really been around this not only democratized decision making, but democratized action. So like, we're going to make this space public and in many cases private. What we want to, we're going to transform it in ways using the occupation of the space is the tool as opposed to the co-opting of the space, but through more ownership strategies and significant infrastructure change or something like that. I don't know the answer. It seems like that's got to be some balance, right? I mean, I'm betting on or investing, my energy and public architecture, which is mine, this energy is betting on the design community. You're not quite betting, but that's where we're putting our energies. And here's the puzzle. It's probably not realistic to think either by number or by insight that the design community is going to be able to make the decisions that all the kinds of decisions we can make at the scale we can make, things like that, to make our public life and I guess our private lives better. So if you accept that limitation, but then accept the other fact that even though they're not trained well enough, which I think is absolutely true, we're not trained well enough. We're the ones that are trained to do this. And it's sort of like, so you can look at Western medicine and you can wring your hands and you can say, Western medicine just isn't really paying attention to so many of the variables that impact our health. So you have a choice to make. Do you turn your back on the kind of Western approach to research in medicine and say, clearly they're blind and they're not really going to help us with a comprehensive view of health? Or do you try to bring Western medicine along for the ride? Because they bring other really extraordinary things. I mean, Europe, in part, a much healthier rural population than we were many years ago, in part because of Western medicine. And so, if the designers, those trained as designers, aren't making these decisions, who is making the decision? And maybe, and I'd be open to it, somebody's going to make an argument, actually, everyday folks should be making these decisions. They'll make better decisions. And the only downside of that is, as you know, as an engineer, there are decisions that need to be made that everyday folks can make or should make, right? And so, I don't know the answer, but even as lumpy and unprepared as the design community is, I sort of want to think the design community, with some luck, can actually step up and be a driver in getting the kind of response to placemaking that we really need. Whether it's true, I don't know. I mean, I can. We're watching hundreds of projects now being done for nonprofits all over the world, or all over the country. And I can tell you, it's riddled with mistakes. And actually, I meant to bring a really nice mistake, and I'm sorry I did, but it's riddled with problems. But the way we're looking at it is those problems are fantastic because finally we're learning we're going to get to learn how to do this, because without the problems, because we haven't been making problems in the past, for very few, we haven't been able to serve those communities. So now we're beginning to serve those communities, so we're screwing up, and we can hopefully learn from it.
So kind of in response to that, or I guess with regard to that, I wonder if we can't learn from the open source software kind of community or example. So as an example, and by the way, I do think that designers are kind of uniquely positioned to help this get going. But in open source software, you have this interesting phenomenon where someone who is oftentimes a very talented engineer will create a thing that solves a problem. But then they'll open source it, and that becomes useful to people in a lot of ways. So first of all, a greater community who has an interest in this emerges to improve that product and maintain it. But also, it serves as like a really good training ground for people. So you can learn a lot about software just by reading people's code, by becoming part of the community, contributing to it. So I wonder, would it be possible to sort of like start open sourcing these projects, so to speak? So perhaps you could use, for instance, if you're making a space for day workers, those people might be the same people who help you build this, or to the more entrepreneurial spirits in that community might be the ones who make it into business. And then people in other communities might be able to feed into that, and I don't know, folks who are interested in gardening might be able to spiffy up or improve that aspect of it. I just wonder if there's maybe something that can be learned from the example of open source software. I understand the problems are very different and software is much easier, but
I don't know the answer. I think it's really interesting. A couple of things I would say. The construction and design industry, particularly the construction industry, are enormously conservative. There's a lot of inertia. There are life safety issues. There are codes that move very, very slowly. The investments are huge. Change is expensive. So there's that. And then on a personal note, I'm 52 years old, and that sounds whack. So in my world, in the way I think about design and designing spaces, and I know you had mentioned more not open source designing, but open source, how do we get others who can build and envision a business model? And honestly, there's got to be some answer there. It seems no question. It's somewhere this has got to break. I mean, here's an interesting thing to think about. There has been a conversation about manufactured housing. What's the cooler term than prefab? But
3D printing?
what is it?
Is it 3D printing houses or something?
Yeah, that sort of thing. It gets made. One is it gets made in this maker environment and then shipped in a flat pack or something like that. And look, this has been talked about for a couple of decades now, and even before that, but pretty actively for a couple of decades. It has gone almost nowhere. And why is that the case? Everyone says, oh, it's much more sustainable, the quality control is much better, it's more affordable, and you can buy it like out of a catalog. And isn't that what America loves? Don't we want to I'm just waiting for there to be like, the Frank Gehry house, the Franklin Wright #2 reissue, And I'm thinking like, that's right around the corner, but it never comes. And I don't know if it's because the nature of building is so site-specific, you just can't do it. Or is it because we're stuck in our ways and, the powers that be just don't allow that to happen? But something about the design and construction world has got such inertia. It'd be great if we could crack it open, but we're not. I haven't seen it. Yes, ma'am.
Well, just to build a little bit on this idea of the open source design, because I've been excited for years, and I don't know if you remember, but we talked about it a couple of years ago. And actually, John tried that like 10 years ago. He had plans made for housing that they were all in this town. This was San Jose. Santa Cruz, right? The people could go and get them and try to build them.
For accessory buildings.
Yes. But what he says is true. There is a lot of kind of conflict because it's a built environment. There is, insurance and all sorts of things involved. But I do think that technology is about to get there to a point where no, it's not going to be, it's going to be like the sharing. It's going to be like the sharing economies that are thriving now, and that's going to happen to architecture and to the built environment, unavoidably. I think that's the new utopia that we have to look at, like how we build these spaces in these environments using the technology at hand. We're not quite there yet, but I think we're getting there. The most people that understand code and open source and all of that gets to positions of power, the more that's going to happen.
Maybe to follow up on that, it strikes me that a lot of what we see as innovation in production and whatnot is really just that like the labor process is like hidden, and something about construction is like your labor forces, like they have to be there on site to put it together. And like, I know there's some restaurant downtown, and this is coming to mind, where it's like, you don't have to interact with anyone, you just order your food on an iPad and it shows up in a cubby, and there's like a screen, and you touch the screen and the thing opens. And I look behind the door and there's like a bunch of Mexican people hidden behind the iPads and the cubbies, taking the orders and making them and putting in the cubbies.
That's false advertising, it's supposed to be made by robots.
It's crazy, but
It's an automat.
Right, I think, but
Yeah.
I think we it's been proven that we don't want that. We want human interaction. So maybe the mistakes of like the innovation in technology has been like, oh, the robots are gonna do everything for us. I think it's more like, no, we're gonna do it all together. Maybe I'm being too.
new codes on paper. Like new
As a friend of an architect, I imagine you know who John Randolph is.
Yeah.
Good friend of mine. I went to Cal Poly SLO or architecture and dropped out.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
It's a bi-coastal pet, or architecture.
Well, that school, I should have gone to Berkeley instead. But anyway, some hugely disproportionate part of the built environment in America and across the world, stuff gets built without, quote unquote, a designer, without somebody who is actually asking aesthetic questions. They're, you know, I grew up in Irvine, you know, in a duplex, in a tract, and if there was an architect or a designer involved, they did a shitty job. And you could say across America, Walnut Creek. I mean, you know, it's slightly different in some cities. And it seems there's nothing like national design care that's ever going to happen. That we're not going to have the kind of revolution in desire where we're going to demand, you know what, I want this to be art. You know, I want this built environment, I want this furniture, I want this space that we're in to be aesthetically thought through as opposed to just dead. And I just, you know, I appreciate that these things are being done, but I just don't know that, like I said, architecture
Say that again, architecture what?
can scale.
Can scale.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, we've certainly seen, it's an interesting question. Yeah, architecture is as carefully crafted, thoughtful, beautiful, responsive to local conditions, can that be scaled? I don't know. I mean, it hasn't. I mean, you could point to big tract homes, but we can't point to any really successful ones. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe it can't be scaled because place is too location based and too fine and too nuanced. But you know, in the same sense, you really can't scale medicine. You know, you can scale pharmaceuticals, but when it comes down to it's some very intimate conversation about what's going on with you to understand whether those pharmaceuticals are appropriate or not. And so we accept that cannot be scaled. Maybe we have to accept the fact that this cannot be scaled. And, you know,
Well, I was trying to make the point is because there is socialized medicine. There is a
yeah, but I'm going to try this after that. I haven't really thought about it much, but there is socialized medicine, but ultimately that medicine is being administered on a one-to-one, very personal basis.
yeah,
Right? After that,
sure. And it's being rational. You know, however you look at it, there's going to be finite set.
We should probably, let's take just a question or two, just so people don't feel trapped here.
I mean, just comment on that briefly. I would say
Yeah.
that the way to scale medicine is to have more people who are aware of what's going on. So what I mean by that is, one of the problems with like Western medicine, so to speak, is that we go to the doctor when there's a problem. So we're like, oh no, I have this horrible pain in my abdomen. It's been going on for 6 months. Help me. And like at that point, it's pretty too far gone a lot of times. On the other hand, the way that you make it scale is if people are more aware of how to take care of themselves, more aware of if we have technologies to help diagnose this earlier, that can solve a lot of the problem that we have now in medicine. I'm not saying that that's directly applicable to architecture, but I do wonder if with technology we're allowing more people to do the design aspect or somehow feed into the design, or again with the open source sort of like analogy, possibly fork design so they can build upon the existing work of other people. I do wonder if it might be possible to engage more people in it and thus like distribute the load to make it more of a thing that's owned by more of the population. Because you're right, architects right now, we don't have enough of them, and we're not going to have 20% of the population be architects or designers probably. Maybe we will. That'd be cool.
Well, riffing off your technology approach, there are apparently, I haven't seen it, but apparently there are, you can take CAD files that have buildings, you can plug it into local code, and it'll assess immediately whether or not it meets code. And so that's one step away from being able to say, look, I don't need to know anything about code, I don't need to know anything about structure, I don't need to know anything about HVAC systems. I've got a software that's sophisticated enough, I can say, oh, I want my living room here, I want it to be this big, and then the software cascades around it and says, okay, well, you've got to have, this will be a safe building because here's the structure to make it work. And so it could be that gets sophisticated enough, it becomes like desktop publishing, that all of a sudden you can design a building and only have your opinion and not have the expertise. So maybe that's
A great model for having operations.
yeah, right, exactly. Right, I suppose there's that, right? Maybe there's at some point you just plug in,
No, I'm saying that facetiously.
Well, but I mean, maybe at some point you say, here's what I feel like, and the screen says, oh, well, it sounds like an appendix. Would you like to have it out? Press here.
Well, this has been a great discussion, and thank you so much, John, for coming and saying your piece, and everyone else for participating. I think we'll let him out of the hot seat. I know you're on East Coast time, and you're late there, so thanks again.